M35A2 long style air pack assembly. This is the technical manual that I'm using as my guide throughout this rebuild. Now we're going to take a look at the parts that are included with the rebuild kit. This is called a felt strip, and there is a second smaller felt strip. There's a couple of large long springs. Okay, in this handful of stuff there are a couple of gaskets, and this black piece is called the piston cup. Now in that small bag there's a lot of small parts. The kit has everything you need except for an O-ring that goes there. Now we're going to start assembling the piston. The first thing I'm going to do is put the pressure plate on with the cup side facing the snap ring collar. Then I'm going to slide that O-ring on. Next thing I'm going to do is put the cup onto the push rod against the pressure plate. As you will see, it is stuck on there and will stay on even if you turn it upside down. Now we will finish assembling the piston. The first thing I need to do is put on the felt ring. Viewed from the end, the felt is shaped like a rectangle. It goes with the widest part pressed down into the groove. This takes a little bit of doing. You sort of have to work it in there all the way around the piston. It helps to be patient. When I got to the end, I discovered that I had a little bit more felt than I needed, so I took some scissors and chopped off the excess. I made sure that the ends were touching when it was pushed down in there. This spring is called the cup expander. Its job is basically to push the cup out against the walls of the cylinder. When you assemble this guy, you have to sit there and work the spring under the edges of the cup, and because it's an expander, it wants to pop out. I thought it would be a good idea to use some Loctite to hold the nut on that holds this piston together. Instead of putting the push rod in a vise and tightening the nut, I'm relying on my driver to get it nice and tight. Completed air cylinder piston. Now we will put the plug back in the slave cylinder body. This is the slave cylinder body. You can look down the bore and see that it's nice and clean. This is the plug that we're going to be putting into it momentarily, and this is the gasket, which is what I would call a copper washer. The head of this plug is very low profile, and you can tighten it with a socket, but you cannot put a wrench on it. Now I'll be working with the push rod bushing assembly. This is the push rod bushing, and this is the seal that goes inside of it. The instructions make a big deal out of getting the seal oriented correctly inside of this push rod bushing. I suggest looking closely at the instructions to make sure that you get the orientation right. You do not want this seal to be upside down. The actual working of the seal into the bushing isn't as hard as it looks. I thought it was fairly easy. The slave cylinder compensator assembly is up next. The instructions say to put a new spring onto the stem of the exhaust valve as shown. Next, we will put the exhaust valve and spring into the cage. Then I will put a new inlet valve onto the stem of the exhaust valve so that the rubber side of the inlet valve faces the cage as shown. Finally, I will put the nut on the stem of the exhaust valve, and it says that one thread of exhaust valve should stick out. Now I'm using Loctite to make sure that it stays put, and relying on my trusty driver to tighten it up sufficiently. Now let's put the slave cylinder compensator assembly back together. The first thing I'm going to do is clean off these gasket surfaces and spray my gaskets with some gasket adhesive. This is not a recommendation. In fact, I really didn't like this stuff. The nozzle kept clogging up on me constantly, and I'm not sure why. It was a brand new bottle. But this is just me trying to give my gaskets the best possible chance to seal. Now I'm bringing in some more of the pieces needed to put this thing back together. There are 4 bolts that will be holding it together. I'm putting the gasket back on the compensator body. And now I'm putting the cage, as it's called, back onto my stack. Next, it's time to put on another gasket. Finally, I'm putting on the cover. Then 4 screws go on. I call them bolts. The instructions call them screws. Those screws have lock washers. And here is the completed slave cylinder compensator assembly. Now for the slave cylinder compensator piston assembly. The instructions say, put the cup into the second groove on the compensator piston. The lip of the cup must face away from the hole in the side of the piston. The first thing that I did was to work this so-called cup, which I would call a seal, up the body of the piston until it reached the lip of the second groove. And then I used this medium-size flathead screwdriver to gently get under the seal and kind of work it up over the lip. And then I started working my way around the piston, getting the seal to sit down in that second groove until it reached a point where it just kind of popped and the whole thing had reached that groove. At this point, part of the seal was still twisted, so I had to spend some time just getting it untwisted and sitting properly down in that second groove on the piston. So now I'm just spending a little bit more time just making sure that that seal is properly seated all the way around and that I can feel the lip sticking out. Next, the instructions say to put the felt ring into the first groove on the compensator piston. So once again, the felt is somewhat rectangular shaped, and you have to lay it the wide way down into this groove. And as I worked my way all the way to the end, I once again found that there was a little bit more than would actually fit. A little bit being 3/16 of an inch in this case. So what did I do? Grab my pair of scissors, and I chopped off about 3/16 of an inch. Then I pressed the felt down into the groove and verified that indeed the ends were touching. Now for the slave cylinder control valve piston assembly. The instructions note that the outer cup has a smaller hole in the center than the inner cup. Push the outer cup over the smaller stem of the control valve piston. The flat face of the outer cup must seat against the end of the control valve piston. Then, push the inner cup over the larger stem of the control valve piston. The flat face of the inner cup must seat against the end of the control valve piston. So when you're done, both cups will be facing outward. Now for the air hydraulic cylinder assembly. First, I will lubricate the piston and seals very well with some .5 brake fluid. Then, I will put the control valve piston into the bore in the slave body. The small end of the control valve piston should point down. Be sure that the lip of the cup does not fold back. Now we will insert the compensator piston into the compensator body. The first thing I'm going to do is thoroughly lubricate all of the moving parts with air tool oil. As you can see, I'm being very liberal in my use of air tool oil. I just want to make sure that everything is coated as thoroughly as possible. And that includes working the parts some up inside the bore just to make sure that everything has gotten as much oil on it as it can. What I'm trying to do is lubricate everything that's in the air domain with air tool oil, and everything that's on the hydraulic side, the actual brake circuit side, with .5 brake fluid. This piston is on the hydraulic side, so I am soaking that felt as much as I possibly can. This spring was part of the rebuild kit. The hole at the top was so off-centered that I was pretty sure it would be rubbing on the shaft of the piston, so here I'm taking pliers to center up that hole. I did fix the spring, and now I'm putting it in fat end first. Now it's time to install the piston. I'm showing how the lip of the seal points down as the piston is installed, and you have to make sure that the seal slides into the bore smoothly. Now it's time to join the compensator body to the slave cylinder body. Here they are sitting side by side. Now I'm trial fitting a gasket. Now I've coated both sides of that gasket with gasket adhesive, and I've cleaned both metal surfaces. I'm pointing out this hole in the side of the compensator body merely as a reference point to know which way to orient that guy. The instructions actually just say to bring the body down onto the slave cylinder, but I'm going to do just the opposite because otherwise that brass piston will drop out the bottom. And the piston that's in the slave cylinder body won't drop out. So I'm going to turn it upside down, and I'm pointing out right now how the holes align between the two pieces. So right now I'm starting that long bolt because I know exactly which of the three holes it goes in, and I'm using that to align the two pieces. And then the other two holes are aligned enough that I can start the two smaller bolts and get them going too. Those two bolts do have lock washers under their heads. And as you can see, the long bolt has a nut that goes on the bottom side, but a lock washer goes on first. So you have to hold that bolt head while tightening up the nut from the bottom side. And this should be the final tightening on this bolt. Now we're going to join the air cylinder shell to the slave cylinder body. The first thing I'm going to do is lubricate this push rod bushing very well with .5 brake fluid. It says put in the push rod bushing wider in first. Then, because the other end of it is in the air domain, I'm going to wipe off the excess .5 brake fluid. It says put a new gasket and O-ring on the air cylinder as shown. But it actually makes more sense to put the O-ring and the gasket on the slave cylinder body. So I'm carefully positioning my gasket to get all the holes lined up, and as you can see, both sides have got gasket adhesive on them. Now I'm putting the lock washers back onto the 4 bolts, and now we're putting the air cylinder back onto the slave cylinder body, and the 4 bolt holes are symmetrical, but there's a 5th hole that you can use for alignment. Now it's time to install the 4 bolts that join these 2 pieces together. Looking down in there, I can see that the 4th hole is slightly misaligned, so I'm going to twist the body slightly to get it aligned well enough that I can get the 4th bolt to start. I did not torque the bolts to a specific value, I just tightened them until they felt good and tight. Next, we must slide the spring retainer over the push rod bushing. The flat side of the spring retainer must seat against the heads of the bolt. Now we'll reinstall the air cylinder piston. The first thing I'm going to do is lubricate the cylinder very well. I can spread the air tool oil around with my hand to coat everything very nicely. The next thing I'm going to do is to lubricate the felt on this piston very thoroughly, making sure that it gets completely soaked. And then I'm going to go ahead and use my hand to spread it all over the outside edges of that piston, just to make sure that everything slides really nice and smooth. And don't forget the push rod. Next, it says to put the spring into the air cylinder so that the small end of the spring is around the spring retainer. Then I will put the push rod through the air cylinder and into the bushing. And I will push the piston into the air cylinder. As you can see, it does take some amount of force. The most force is required to get that seal past the edge of the cylinder. Once you get past that, it slides more easily. As you can see, as you push the piston down, it stays down. Now we'll put on the end cover. It says to put on the non-metallic washer. This is what I would call a gasket. The gasket that came with the rebuild kit was a little bit oversized on the outside edge, and this caused several problems. The biggest one was that it was kind of pushing the gasket out of position and causing it not to seat properly around the edges of the cylinder. That's a big deal. Also, it was making the end cap harder to install, and when I did manage to get the end pushed on, the threads on those studs had eaten away at 6 positions on the gasket, kind of carving notches in the edges of the gasket. So I figured I would use scissors to go ahead and kind of enlarge those notches so that the gasket would seat properly. Doing that did make a difference. With those notches, the gasket seated properly, and I was satisfied with the final results. but I highly encourage you to closely inspect this particular seal to make sure that the gasket is in the position that you think it is. The instructions say to align the mark on the air cylinder with the mark on the end cover. I don't actually have any mark to align to, but I can look at the position of the holes, the oil hole and the J-tube hole, and just make sure that they're aligned properly with reference to the rest of the air pack. This is the correct position, the position I'm putting it on right now. It did take a little bit of hand pounding to get it to go on. And now what I'm doing is looking very carefully at the gasket all the way around and making sure that it's actually seated in the position that I think it should be. Then it's time to put on a lock washer and a nut on all 6 of those studs. And here is the final tightening of each one of those nuts on those 6 studs. The main reason I include stuff like this is so you can see for yourself how tight I'm getting them. In this case, I'm getting them tight, but not insanely tight, if you know what I mean. Now for the air tube. When I did this job, I created some cheat sheets that were intended to show me exactly where every external fitting went and what tools to use to attach them. The next thing I'm going to do is put pipe joint compound on the threads of all of my fittings. The truth is, only the NPT threaded fittings need pipe joint compound, and I would say that probably all of the ones that have a copper washer do not need pipe joint compound, but I did put pipe joint compound on all of my fittings. I do not think it will hurt anything. I took care to wipe off any of the excess that would have contaminated my fluids. And now I'm starting the first fitting that is one that air tube attaches to. Externally, the other air tube fitting looks identical, but if you look down the bore of it, you will see that the 2 fittings have very different internal sizes. The one with the smaller hole is the one that goes on the end where I am wrenching right now. Now I'm going to attach the air tube. Both ends of the tube use an inverted flare fitting that basically makes it seal by pressing the tube really hard against the fitting that it's joining to. So the seal is only going to be as good as how tight you're able to make the nut go into the fitting. This page of the TM has an error that cost me many hours. I have made the correction. I find it hard to believe that in all these years nobody ever got this fixed. Here's the piston cup and pushrod seal. The pushrod seal has the larger opening because it has to go around the pushrod. Now, this being in the hydraulic domain, I'm going to go ahead and lubricate both the bore and the individual parts with .5 brake fluid. Right now I am lubricating the pushrod seal. The next thing I'm going to lubricate is just called the piston. And I'm going to coat the outside of it, and then I decide that maybe it would be a good idea to even have some fluid in the inside of it. Here's what the instructions say. Put the pushrod seal into the hole in the end of the slave cylinder body with the lip facing out. Then, put the piston into the hole in the slave cylinder body. Next, put the piston cup into the hole in the slave cylinder body with the lip facing out. Finally, put the spring retainer into the slave cylinder body. The small end of the spring retainer must go in first. This is the next page of the instructions, and again, there's an omission. I do not understand in all those years how this could not have gotten fixed. Okay, so the first step here is to put the gasket, which I call a copper washer, onto the plug. Then it says to put the inner spring inside the outer spring and put the springs inside the slave cylinder body as shown. So now I will install the inner spring inside the outer spring. And install it into the slave cylinder body. Now, the drawing doesn't show this, but here is a cone that helps keep that spring centered inside that end plug. So I'm lubricating it first, and now I'm just testing to see how firm it is to push it in there. I'm going to put the end plug on, and then it's going to require quite a bit of force, but I am going to be able to push everything inside. And it takes me both hands, but I am able to get those threads started. This is a powerful driver with 3 different torque settings, and I was using the lowest one there. From here on out, we're just going to be installing external fittings. This is not something in the manual, but it's something that taking some still frames from my disassembly video really helped me on. This is actually the brake bleeding fitting. The fitting that goes here has a copper washer. As you can see, I've gone ahead and put some pipe thread compound on all of my threads. And right now I'm just trying to reinstall copper washers on the fittings that need it. That washer looked identical to the one I'm holding now, but one would go on and one wouldn't. But it turns out that that other washer would go onto this fitting. If you decide that you're going to take your fittings off like I did, be sure that you have a plan for getting them back to where they came from. I hope that my cheat sheets will help some with that, but you know, if you can make notes on which ones came from where on your own air pack, that probably is the best thing that you can do. Again, this one has a copper washer. And here comes another one with a copper washer. This fitting I believe to be steel and not brass, although it had kind of a copper coating on it that probably helped with rust. This is what the manual calls the hydraulic stoplight switch, and I believe it's probably a good idea to replace it with a new one. To be very honest, the only reason I didn't do that is because I didn't think of it. At least it's easy to get to on the truck. Okay, now I'm bringing in a fitting that it kind of looks like it has the same threads on both sides, but trust me, both sides are not the same. So pay attention to the bevel and the inside diameter of each one of them. There is a difference, and this is a good one to pay attention to when you're taking the thing apart. So not many fittings to go. Here is the male 90-degree elbow, and as you can see, it ends up facing away from us towards the air cylinder, towards the J tube, the air tube. And now we're going to be putting in a male-female fitting that goes into this hole on the side. And if I'm not mistaken, it ends up pointing exactly the opposite direction of the other 90-degree fitting. And finally, it's time for the plug that, if you do what you're supposed to, my understanding is you're supposed to add oil through this hole once a year on the truck. And you better believe that I intend to do that from now on. Now this job is complete, and after some cleaning and priming and painting, this is what it looked like. Thank you very much for watching this video.